Tantor Audio, a division of recorded books, presents Toll for the Dead, an Oxford murder mystery by M.S. Morris. Narrated by Esther Wane. Chapter 1. The pews of St. Michael and All Angels were already filling up. It was going to be a good turnout for the funeral. From her vantage point in the ringing chamber of the church tower, Amy Baggott peered through the interior latticed window into the nave below. It looked as if the whole village had come to pay their respects to Mr. Henry Burton, the old squire, as he was fondly known to the residents of Hambledon-on-Thames. The old man, who had been ill for some time, had died peacefully the previous week, at home in Hambledon Manor, having been cared for by his loyal housekeeper and, latterly, a nurse from a private agency. Amy knew all this because her parents, Robert and Sue Baggott, ran the Eight Bells pub in the village, and were therefore privy to all the gossip and goings-on in this close-knit community. A keen bell-ringer from a young age, Amy was delighted to have been asked to join the band of 8 ringers to ring a quarter peal at the end of the service. It would be a fitting tribute to Henry Burton, who had contributed generously towards the restoration of the bells in the year 2000, as part of the village's millennium celebrations. The previous evening she had accompanied Bill Harris, the tower captain, and the man who had taught her everything she knew about change-ringing, into the bell chamber, 2 floors above where the ringers now waited, to fit leather muffles to each of the 8 bell clappers. As a mark of respect, the bells would be rung half-muffled, creating an eerie echo effect that never failed to send shivers down Amy's spine. She checked her watch. 10 to 12. The funeral was due to start at midday, to be followed by a wake at the 8 Bells pub, the traditional venue for all village celebrations and memorials. Amy had persuaded her boyfriend, Jake Derwent, to take the day off work and meet her in the pub after the bell ringing. Once they'd had something to eat, she thought they might go for a walk along the Thames path. She'd been dating the detective sergeant for precisely 2 months, 3 weeks and 5 days. She had met him through an online dating app, although her early attempts at finding love that way had not gone well, and she'd almost given up hope. But then Jake had popped up, and she'd taken an instant liking to the ginger-haired and bearded Yorkshireman. He looks like a decent sort of guy, she'd thought, and she hadn't been wrong. At 6'5" tall, he definitely stood out in a crowd. He was funny and kind, and didn't think she was a nerd for being so passionate about bell-ringing. And she was fascinated by his work. She'd always loved reading murder mysteries, and here was her very own detective who solved crimes and caught real-life killers. She'd never been happier. 5 minutes to go, said Bill Harris in his soft Oxfordshire burr. Amy didn't know how old Bill was, but he must be 75 if he was a day. Tall and white-haired, with overgrown eyebrows, a lifetime of climbing bell towers and ringing the tenor bell had kept him lean and fit. Amy admired that sort of dedication in a person. She hoped she'd still be ringing bells when she was his age. She peered again through the latticed window. Down below, Harriet Stevenson, the churchwarden, was handing out orders of service and directing the last stragglers to the few remaining spaces in the packed pews. Bossy and officious, Harriet was clearly in her element as organiser-in-chief. Amy tried to spot people she knew. Her dad, Robert, was sitting on the edge of a pew close to the north door, so that he could slip out during the last hymn. Her mum had stayed behind at the pub to prepare the food for the wake, and her dad had promised to join her before the end of the funeral to help. But he wanted to pay his respects, as the old squire had owned the pub, and had always been a fair and generous landlord, never stinting on repairs to the half-timbered building that dated back to the 17th century. Harriet Stevenson was directing a small group of 3 women and a man to one of the reserved pews closer to the front. These were the people from the manor house, and heads turned to watch as they took their places. Lindsay Simmons, an imperious woman in a striking black hat, had been Henry Burton's estate manager. Amy only knew her by sight because Lindsay rarely came into the pub or got involved in village activities. Behind her was the diminutive figure of Josephine Daniels, the old squire's devoted housekeeper. Amy and Bill had run into Josephine the previous evening, when she'd been in the church doing the flowers for the funeral. In her capacity as the church flower arranger, she had done her old employer proud, adorning the church with exquisite displays of white roses and irises, grown, as she had told them, in the gardens of the manor house. Her son, Sean, who was the gardener at the house, came next. Amy had never seen him wearing a suit and tie before, and he tugged self-consciously at the collar of his shirt as he shuffled forward. Bringing up the rear of the party was a short, plump woman with a kindly face. Amy didn't recognize her, but wondered if she might be the nurse who'd cared for the old man in his dying days. On the other side of the aisle, Amy recognized the blonde head of her old school friend, Kaylee Simpson, now the local primary school teacher, and fiancée of Jamie Reed, one of the 8 bell ringers. Their forthcoming wedding at the weekend would be another, more joyous occasion for ringing the bells, and one that Amy was especially looking forward to. Maybe one day she and Jake would get married in this church, and a quarter peal would be rung in celebration. She imagined herself in a simple ivory gown, nothing too fancy, just, "It's time," said Bill, getting to his feet and taking hold of the sally of the tenor bell. Amy's attention switched immediately from thoughts of matrimony back to the funeral. With a firm, practised stroke, Bill pulled down on the sally, and 2 floors above in the bell chamber, the heaviest and lowest pitched of the 8 bells rang out its solemn toll. The toll for the dead. At the sound of the half-muffled bell, a few heads in the nave turned towards the north door in anticipation of the arrival of the coffin. The members of the church choir, seated in the stalls near the altar, rose to their feet in readiness. At a nod from the conductor, the organist began to play the opening bars of Mozart's Ave Verum Corpus. Then, following their instructions in the order of service, the congregation also stood. The funeral was about to begin. As the single bell continued to toll and the choir sang, the coffin, adorned with a simple bouquet of white lilies, was borne into the church on the shoulders of 6 black-clad pallbearers supplied by the funeral directors in Oxford. The Reverend Martin Armistead, a youngish man who had been appointed vicar of St. Michael and All Angels 12 months earlier, when the last incumbent had died, after a record-breaking stint of 37 years, led the small procession. Behind the coffin, the deceased's immediate family followed. The old squire's son looked to be in his mid-40s or thereabouts, with a thick head of hair, greying only slightly at the temples. Amy supposed that this man, Tobias Burton, who held himself so ramrod straight, was the squire now. But if she knew anything about the villagers of Hambledon-on-Thames, it was his father who would always be known as the squire. The villagers were a loyal bunch, but their loyalty had to be earned. Next to Tobias, her hand looped in the crook of her husband's elbow, walked his wife, slim and elegant in a black dress, fitted jacket and high heels. Their 2 children, a boy and a girl aged about 12 and 10, followed dutifully behind their parents. Amy's heart went out to them, having to walk behind their grandfather's coffin at such a young age. Couldn't they have sat with a relative or friend of the family? But maybe they didn't know anyone here. The family didn't actually live in the village. That in itself was a matter for gossip and speculation in the pub and village shop. Apparently the son was something big in the city, although actual facts were rather thin on the ground. Some said he'd made a fortune in the property business. Others said it was the stock market, or overseas investments of dubious propriety. Whatever the case, the talk of the village was what he would do with the manor house now that his father had passed away. Amy hadn't paid that much attention to the gossip. She'd been far too distracted with Jake. But she understood that feelings were running high in some quarters. There was even talk of a schism in the village. Things could turn nasty. The coffin was placed on a bier at the front of the nave, just below the pulpit, and the tenor bell came finally to a halt. The family took their places in the empty front pew. The vicar, always slightly nervous and ill at ease in Amy's opinion, spoke some words of welcome, and the service began. In his eulogy, the vicar spoke warmly of the dead man. It sounded as if the vicar and his wife had personally appreciated the welcome extended to them by the old squire. Particular mention was made of Henry Burton's generosity towards village life, how he'd contributed towards the upkeep of the church, how he wasn't above enjoying a pint in the pub, and how he had opened up the gardens of the manor house every year for the annual summer fete. Heads nodded in agreement, and handkerchiefs dabbed at eyes as people remembered the old man. The village hadn't just lost its lord of the manor, it had lost a dear friend. As the organ struck up the opening chords of the final hymn, "And did those feet in ancient time walk upon England's mountains green," the pall-bearers hoisted the coffin onto their shoulders once again, and the 8 ringers took their positions, facing each other in a circle, ready to ring the quarter peal. Amy now had her back to the latticed window, but even if she'd been facing it, she would have paid no attention to what was happening down below. The focus of the ringers was now entirely on each other. The quarter peal would last for around 45 minutes, during which time Henry Burton would be laid to rest in the family plot in the churchyard. As the ringer of the treble bell, it was Amy's job to begin the round. Opposite her, on bell number 5, Jamie Reed gave her a reassuring smile. She clutched the sally in both hands, and at a nod from Bill, said the words that heralded the start of the ringing. "Look to! Treble's going!" She pulled down firmly on the rope. "Treble's gone!" Harriet Stevenson walked diligently up and down the rows of pews, putting hymn books back in their place the right way round, straightening the kneelers and seat cushions, and gathering various items of lost property. Really, it was quite astonishing how careless people could be with their belongings. She'd already found a pair of reading glasses, a mobile phone, and 2 folded umbrellas, whose owners had sensibly come prepared for the vagaries of an English summer. Small mercies that the rain had held off, since the missing lead from the church roof still hadn't been replaced, and the roof had a tendency to leak on the 3rd pew from the front, south side of the aisle. She would have to speak to the vicar, again, about getting it fixed. He'd been in the job for a year now, and it was high time he dealt with the issues that she raised repeatedly at their monthly meetings. Harriet took her job as churchwarden very seriously. She was pleased with how well the funeral had gone, thanks in no small part to her organisational skills. It was she who had arranged for the printing of the orders of service and spoken to Josephine Daniels about the appropriate choice of flowers. She had even selected all the music and the hymns. The squire's son had left these matters to the vicar, and he, in turn, had delegated them to her. Well, that was only right and proper. Harriet had known Henry Burton for many years, and believed she knew exactly what sort of music he would have liked. She felt that Jerusalem as the final hymn had been an inspired choice, moving and uplifting in equal measure. If only the bells hadn't started their ringing at the same time as the organ was playing. What a din! Harriet was all for tradition, but those bell-ringers were a law unto themselves, and you could hardly hear the organ once they started ringing, even if the bells were half muffled. They were still going now. Would they never stop? She placed the items she'd found in a neat pile on the front pew on the north side of the church, and then began her inspection of the south side. This was where the squire's family had sat during the service, the children fidgeting, their mother dry-eyed and coldly indifferent to the whole proceedings, as if the funeral were nothing more than an inconvenience to her. Henry's son, Tobias Burton, had never once bowed his head, even during the prayers. What would poor Henry have made of such a display from his own family? She was going to have a battle on her hands in the coming weeks and months over the son's plans for the manor house. Tobias Burton had made no secret of his intention to turn the house into a luxury hotel and spa, and clearly couldn't wait to get his hands on his inheritance. He had even begun scoping out the site while his poor father lay dying, insensible to the world. Harriet didn't believe for 1 minute that Henry Burton would have sanctioned his son's mercenary plans. The manor house was a cornerstone of village life, and the lord of the manor's place was in the house, not living away in London. Harriet relished the prospect of taking on Tobias Burton and his greedy scheme to redevelop the manor house and its grounds. Her long and distinguished career as an Oxford academic hadn't been achieved by taking the easy route in life, and she had no intention of spending her retirement tending her roses and baking cakes. In addition to her duties as churchwarden, she was also chairperson of Hambledon Parish Council. Nothing happened in Hambledon-on-Thames without Harriet's knowledge, and rarely without her say-so. She was a great believer in the values of continuity and tradition, and if continuity and tradition were to be trampled into the mud and thrown to the winds in a small village in South Oxfordshire, then there really was no hope for the future. No. As long as Harriet Stevenson had blood in her veins and air in her lungs, she would fight tooth and nail for what she believed in, and she certainly did not believe that a Tudor manor house, whose foundations dated back to before the Wars of the Roses, should be turned into a hotel. As if she didn't already have enough on her plate, what with the threatened closure of the village school. That was another battle she intended to win, for the sake of the children, as well as for the teachers, especially that nice Cayley Simpson. The school had stood for 150 years, and if Harriet had her way, it would continue to serve the community for 150 more. From the pews on the south side, she retrieved a second pair of reading glasses, and no fewer than 6 carelessly dropped orders of service. She gathered all of the lost property into a single pile, which she would display at the back of the church later for people to collect. Then, with the weighty ideas of history and tradition still on her mind, she stepped into the north transept for a moment of contemplation at the tomb of Henry Burton's distinguished ancestors, Lord Edmund and Lady Ellen Burton. Edmund, who had been a wealthy merchant in Tudor times, had been granted the manor house as a favour by Henry VIII, after the king seized it during the dissolution of Abingdon Abbey in 1538. The husband, who had died in 1577, during the reign of Elizabeth I, and his wife, who had passed away a year earlier, were now immortalised for all eternity, their limestone effigies lying in peaceful repose atop the elaborate marble tomb that dominated the north transept. Here was tradition for you, but also a powerful memento mori. Remember that you will die. As Harriet stood in quiet contemplation, the bells continuing their incessant ringing, how they irritated her. She sensed, rather than heard, a movement behind her. It was probably one of the owners of the reading glasses come back to reclaim their lost property. She hoped they would be suitably grateful to her for having taken the trouble to gather all of the lost items together. She turned to see who it was, but in that moment a heavy object came crashing down on top of her head. Her knees buckled under her, and she collapsed onto the cold flagstones. If Harriet Stevenson had been capable of thought in that moment, she would no doubt have deplored the mess that her blood was making as it spilled over the floor. But all thoughts, whether of lost property, the future of the manor house, the weight of tradition, or the leaky church roof, were beyond her now. The bells continued to ring, but she had ceased to hear them. They would never bother her again. Chapter 2. Have you got your calculator? Yes, Mum. What about your protractor? Yes, Mum, stop fussing. A ruler? Spare pencils? Mum, you're making me nervous. Sorry, it's just that I had a dream last night. I was about to do a maths exam, and when I turned over the paper, I realised I'd forgotten my pencil case and wouldn't be able to answer any of the questions. Bridget put the car in gear and headed out of Wolvercote. Chloe laughed. Honestly, Mum, anyone would think that you're the one sitting your GCSEs. Trust me, said Bridget. This is 10 times worse. Chloe was in the middle of her GCSE exams at school, and Bridget had never felt more stressed, even when she'd been sitting her history finals at Oxford. Her daughter had been at home on so-called study leave since Easter, but Bridget constantly fretted over how much actual studying was being done. Too often she would pop into Chloe's room with a cup of tea and find her on a video call with her best friend Olivia, or more often, her boyfriend Alfie. Olivia and I were just testing each other on chemistry, Chloe explained on one such occasion. Bridget wasn't sure she entirely believed her. She didn't recall chemistry eliciting such gales of laughter when she'd been a schoolgirl. Maybe it was taught in a more engaging and creative way nowadays, but there was only so much fun you could get out of the periodic table of the elements. On top of Chloe's exams, Bridget's sister Vanessa was giving her a hard time over her latest project, to persuade their ageing parents to sell their house in Lyme Regis and move to a retirement home, preferably closer to Oxford. It was a good idea in principle. Their mother's health had been poor in recent years, and their father was finding it increasingly difficult to cope, despite all protestations to the contrary. A nice retirement home would be ideal for them, Vanessa had insisted. So much easier and more comfortable. But their mum and dad didn't see it that way, and, despite Bridget's half-hearted encouragement, had refused to move. Perhaps they'd be happy if we just let them stay where they are, Bridget had told Vanessa last time they discussed the matter. But Vanessa was impossible once she'd made up her mind about something. You're only saying that because you hardly ever go to see them. I do all the work, driving up and down to Dorset to sort things out. The accusation was unfair, as Bridget couldn't easily get away from work. But Vanessa was right about her parents needing more support. A retirement home might well be the best solution. But her mum and dad were as stubborn as Vanessa, and an impasse had been reached, with neither side willing to budge, and Bridget caught in between. As if her parents' living arrangements and Chloe's exams weren't enough to worry about, there was the upcoming wedding of Bridget's ex-husband, Ben, to his fiancée, Tamsin. Bridget was dreading the event, and still hadn't bought an outfit for the occasion. Chloe, meanwhile, would be chief bridesmaid, and was supposed to attend yet another dress-fitting in London this weekend. But Bridget had put her foot down, and insisted that the dress-fitting would have to wait until the exams were over. That didn't leave much time before the wedding, but for once Bridget had got her way, and had savoured every moment of this small victory. Right now, Chloe was in the thick of the exams, which entailed her sometimes going into school in the mornings and sometimes in the afternoons, depending on the exam timetable. Whenever she could, Bridget gave her a lift to make sure she got there on time. That was another of her recurring nightmares, arriving late for an exam and finding the doors locked and bolted against her. Just one more week of this, and she'd be able to relax. Today's paper was pure mathematics, the thought of which was enough to make Bridget break out into a cold sweat. She couldn't for the life of her remember the first thing about simultaneous equations or trigonometry. She turned onto the Woodstock Road, praying that there wouldn't be any traffic hold-ups. It would be just like Oxford City Council to embark on major roadworks in the middle of the exam season. But for once her prayers were answered, and she dropped Chloe off at the school gates 20 minutes ahead of schedule. "Good luck," she called as Chloe got out of the car. "Thanks, Mum," Chloe waved and walked away. I forgot to ask her if she's got a pencil sharpener, thought Bridget. But it was too late now. Chloe had disappeared. She was about to drive away. A mound of paperwork awaited her on her desk in Kidlington, when her phone rang. Bridget checked the caller display. It was the duty sergeant. He wouldn't be calling her unless it was something important. Detective Inspector Bridget Hart speaking. "Ma'am, there's been an incident at the church in Hambledon-on-Thames." Bridget recalled the pretty little village where she and Jonathan had once enjoyed a pub lunch after an invigorating, if muddy, walk along the Thames path. She listened to what the duty sergeant was telling her. A woman brutally murdered, uniform at the scene, and immediately all concerns about exams and weddings were pushed firmly from her mind. "I can be there in half an hour," she said. She slid the car into gear and drove off in the direction of the Oxford Ring Road. A murder investigation. Just what she needed to cure her of exam anxiety. Chapter 3. The Church of St. Michael and All Angels enjoyed a picturesque location at the heart of the village of Hambledon, directly opposite the War Memorial and next to the old manor house. It was hard to imagine a more tranquil setting. And yet, as Detective Sergeant Jake Derwent examined the body lying in the north transept of the church, It was apparent that an act of savage violence had been committed here. The amount of blood that had spread across the flagstone floor indicated a vicious attack involving a heavy object, although he hadn't yet been able to locate the murder weapon. Just half an hour earlier, he'd been relaxing with a lunchtime pint in the 8 Bells, chatting to Amy's mum and dad as they laid out food for the wake. "The church is packed," Robert Baggett had reported after returning from the funeral. "It's nice to see people making a real effort to send off the old squire." "He'll be missed in the village, that's for sure," said Sue. "What a fine gentleman he was." Jake had grown to like Robert and Sue Baggett very much. Meeting your girlfriend's parents could be a daunting experience, but in the case of Amy's parents, Jake had hit it off with them straight away. They were relaxed, easygoing and chatty, an ideal couple to be running a village pub, and seemed delighted that he was dating their daughter. "A policeman?" Sue had said approvingly, on hearing what he did for a living, quickly followed by, "And aren't you tall?" Jake was more than happy to wait in the pub with them while Amy finished ringing the quarter peal, or whatever it was called. She had tried to explain the principles of change ringing to him, but he had quickly become bewildered by all the jargon, and unable to grasp the difference between grandsire triples and Kent treble bob major. He was quite content to leave the world of bell-ringing to her. He and Amy had been going out for a couple of months now, and he was surprised at how quickly she had become such a big part of his life. He never imagined that he would get on so well with someone who worked at the Bodleian Library, and whose idea of a good evening out was climbing an old church tower to ring bells. And yet he felt completely relaxed in her company. She was such an easy person to hang out with, and the fact that her parents ran a pub, and that Amy herself was a keen beer drinker, could only be a bonus. People had started arriving at the pub just after 1:45. They had helped themselves from the lavish spread of food that was laid out, and then spilled out into the pub garden which sloped down to the river bank, making the most of the warm June sunshine. Jake had overheard snippets of conversation. Weren't the flowers lovely, and hadn't the choir sung beautifully, and didn't the vicar give a fitting eulogy? People seemed to have enjoyed the funeral, if that was the right way of looking at it. The bells had continued ringing while the coffin was being interred in the family burial plot, the sound carrying easily on the summer's air. And then, shortly after 1:30, Amy had rushed into the pub, red-faced, with the shocking news that the bell-ringers had discovered the body of an elderly lady in the church, and could Jake come with her at once to take charge of the situation? "I'll come and take a look," he told her, setting down his half-finished drink on the bar. "But there won't be much for me to do. The paramedics will deal with everything when they arrive. Someone has called for an ambulance, haven't they?" "You don't understand," said Amy breathlessly, grabbing his hand and pulling him off the bar stool. "She's been murdered!" He had accompanied her to the church where Bill Harris, the senior bell-ringer, had met them at the door. "This way, Sergeant," he said gravely. "It's a bad business. A very bad business." The 6 other bell-ringers were standing guard inside the church. Jake recognised Jamie Reed, who was the same age as him and due to get married at the weekend to Amy's best friend, Kaylee Simpson. The 4 of them had enjoyed a drink in the pub only the other week. "I called the police as soon as we discovered the body," said Jamie. "A car is on its way from Abingdon." "You did the right thing, mate," said Jake. "Now, show me where the body is." It had indeed been a brutal attack. The victim was an elderly woman, smartly dressed in a tweed skirt and jacket, but that jacket was now splattered with blood. More blood had spread out in a large arc around her head. It was smudged at the edge, as if someone had caught it with the toe of their shoe. "Did one of you accidentally step in the blood?" Jake asked. The bell-ringers all shook their heads. "No," said Bill. "We were careful not to disturb anything." Jake nodded. The bell-ringers may have been careful, but someone had left bloody footprints on the flagstone floor. To Jake's untrained eye, they were just smears, but it was possible that the scene of crime officers would be able to glean something from the marks. He kneeled next to the body to examine the victim more closely. "It's Harriet Stevenson," volunteered one of the women bell-ringers in answer to Jake's unasked question. She's the churchwarden here, or she was. I expect she'll have been tidying up after the funeral when she was attacked.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?